Deep beneath the Arctic ice in the winter of 1968, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine embarked on what should have been a routine deterrence patrol. Yet from the moment it slipped beneath the surface, something felt wrong to the crew, because the K-class boats were notorious for mechanical instability, electrical faults, and poor ventilation that left every corner smelling of diesel fumes and overheated wiring. And as the submarine pushed deeper into its icy route, the men aboard could feel the hull creaking under pressure like a steel beast groaning in its sleep. While the captain, an officer known for his strictness and refusal to show fear, paced the control room with a silence that only heightened the tension. And in the missile compartment, sailors performed their endless checks beside warheads capable of leveling entire cities, quietly aware that one failure, one spark, one misreading of the environmental controls could turn the submarine into a floating catastrophe. Morale was low, the air was humid and stale, and equipment that should have been replaced years earlier rattled and buzzed with every shift in current, until one night a faint electrical burning smell drifted through the forward compartments, so subtle that most ignored it. But a young technician noticed the scent growing stronger around a power distribution panel, whose temperature readings had begun to fluctuate, and he hesitated, because on a Soviet submarine, reporting a malfunction often meant blame, paperwork, or punishment. But finally approached his commanding officer, only to be told sharply that the readings were within tolerance and that he should return to his post. Yet over the next several hours the smell intensified, mixing with the warm metallic air of the submarine until some of the crew began coughing without knowing why. And at 02:17, a violent burst of light erupted from the same panel, sending a wave of fire roaring down the corridor, igniting insulation materials and plunging the submarine into chaos as alarms shrieked and smoke, thick and black, poured through the ventilation system, threatening not only the lives of every man on board, but the stability of the missile compartment where heat spikes could trigger catastrophic failures, leaving the captain no choice but to order portions of the submarine sealed off, even though he knew that meant condemning the men trapped behind those bulkhead doors to a fate they would never escape. As the fire spread through the forward compartments, visibility dropped to almost zero, turning the submarine's narrow passageways into smoke-filled tunnels where sailors crawled blindly, choking and feeling their way along scorching hot metal walls, while emergency lights flickered erratically like dying stars. And in the control room, officers struggled to stabilize electrical systems that were now shorting out one by one, each failure triggering a cascade of new problems that threatened the nuclear reactor itself. Because without functioning coolant pumps, the reactor core would begin to overheat. And an overheating reactor inside a steel coffin, hundreds of meters below the Arctic surface, meant not just the death of the crew, but the potential release of radioactive contamination into waters monitored obsessively by NATO, which would certainly provoke international panic. Meanwhile, in the sealed-off compartment behind the bulkhead, the trapped men pounded desperately on the door, their shouts muffled by layers of steel, begging to be released, even though the officers on the other side understood that opening that door would allow the fire to surge forward like a living creature starved of oxygen, consuming the rest of the submarine within minutes. And the captain, haunted by the sound of fists slamming against metal, had to force himself to ignore their pleas as he directed his executive officer to prepare for an emergency ascent, a maneuver requiring careful control of buoyancy tanks that were now malfunctioning because fire had burned through vital wiring. Still, the crew worked frantically, manually cranking valves that normally required electrical power, and just as oxygen levels began to drop dangerously low, the submarine jerked upward in a steep climb, the hull groaning as it rose toward the surface through layers of crushing black water. While the captain radioed a coded distress message to Soviet Northern Fleet headquarters, knowing full well that even if they reached the surface, Arctic storms could tear the damaged sub apart before rescue vessels arrived. And in the missile compartment, technicians battled rising temperatures around the warheads themselves, terrified that a structural failure could allow seawater to breach the internal missile tubes and potentially trigger a chain reaction of mechanical collapses that would scatter radioactive debris across hundreds of miles of ocean, making this not simply a submarine emergency, but a disaster with geopolitical consequences far beyond the men fighting for breath inside the steel chamber. When K-371 finally broke through the surface, the submarine did not emerge triumphantly, but lurched into the storm like a wounded animal, its bow slamming against violent Arctic waves that washed across the deck and rattled the already weakened hull. While inside, the captain ordered the crew to prepare for the cold shock of opening the conning tower hatch, because without venting the toxic smoke that filled the interior, the men would lose consciousness within minutes. Sailors climbed the ladder with trembling hands, forcing the frozen hatch open as a blast of frigid air rushed inside, sweeping the smoke outward, but also dropping the internal temperature so fast that condensation turned to frost on the control panels, making already damaged systems crackle and fail. And on the horizon, the sky was beginning to glow with the eerie green swirl of an approaching polar storm, which meant rescue ships might not reach them in time. Yet the crew had no choice but to remain surfaced because the fire had destroyed too many systems for a safe descent, leaving them exposed in waters where NATO aircraft regularly patrolled. And the captain knew that if a foreign reconnaissance plane spotted them now, adrift, damaged, and unable to dive, it could trigger accusations that the Soviets were testing missile launches or suffering a nuclear accident, either of which could escalate military readiness across Europe. Meanwhile, inside the sealed compartment, the men who had survived the fire were freezing and starving, banging weakly against the bulkhead in the hope that someone would come. But the officers stood grim and silent, fully aware that opening the bulkhead could reintroduce smoke or destabilize pressure levels. And as the storm winds intensified, the submarine began drifting toward a field of pack ice that could crush the hull like an aluminum can, forcing the captain to improvise manual steering procedures usually reserved for wartime emergencies. While above them, dark clouds rolled in at alarming speed, lightning cracking across the sky, as though nature itself were punishing the steel leviathan that had dared surface in its domain. And still the nuclear reactor remained a ticking clock, its coolant reserves dangerously low, its internal structure weakened by heat damage, the engineers racing to jury-rig a cooling system out of spare parts and scorched tubing, knowing that if they failed, the Arctic Ocean would witness a radiological catastrophe unlike anything seen during the Cold War. Not a warhead detonation, but the slow, horrifying release of reactor core contamination into waters shared by the world's most powerful militaries. As the blizzard engulfed K-371, visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the submarine became a barely distinguishable silhouette, battered by towering waves. While inside, the officers gathered around a dim emergency lamp to debate their remaining options, none of which looked good, because the radio mast, already damaged during surfacing, was now being hammered by wind and ice, making long-range communication unreliable and leaving the crew unsure whether their distress signals were even reaching the Soviet Northern Fleet. And every minute counted as the storm dragged the submarine farther north into denser multi-year ice fields where rescue ships could not follow. Meanwhile, the food situation was growing desperate. The sealed compartment with the surviving sailors from the fire still isolated and unheated, their voices weakening to faint knocks as frostbitten hands tapped the bulkhead, and the captain was haunted by the possibility that he might be forced to choose between risking the entire vessel to save a few dying men or maintaining sealing protocols and letting nature complete what the fire had started. But before he could decide, a sudden cracking sound echoed through the hull as shifting ice floes collided with the submarine side, scraping along the steel like the claws of some ancient creature, sending vibrations through every deck and raising the terrifying possibility that the weakened hull plates, warped by fire and stress, might fail under pressure. Down in the engineering section, the reactor specialists were wrestling with the jury-rigged cooling system, which was beginning to leak again as the temperature dropped, forcing them to crawl through freezing water mixed with hydraulic fluid, while manually pumping coolant to keep the reactor from overheating or shutting down entirely, because if the reactor went cold without proper procedure, the restart could fail, turning K371 into a powerless metal coffin drifting under the ice. But even worse was the specter of a partial meltdown if the improvised coolant failed, while the storm kept them from evacuating, a scenario that would contaminate the Arctic and risk detection by NATO surveillance planes that were always listening for unusual radiation signatures. Back on the bridge, the crew huddled around the navigation chart, where the helmsman pointed to their drift path, showing they were being pulled toward a massive ridge of pressure ice, known by sailors as the White Wall, a place where even icebreakers avoided, because the moving slabs could shear a vessel in half. And with shockingly little time left, the captain ordered all available power routed to propulsion, despite the strain on the damaged reactor, in a last attempt to maneuver K371 away from the deadly ice, while monstrous waves crashed over the bow, and the Arctic storm threatened to erase the submarine and its crew from existence without a single missile ever being launched in anger. The attempt to power out of the drift was brutal on both the crew and the submarine, as K371 shuddered violently with each surge from the overworked reactor, the deck vibrating so hard that tools fell from racks and men had to brace themselves against bulkheads to stay upright. While below them, the propulsion shafts groaned like tortured steel under forces they were never meant to endure. But even with the throttles pushed beyond safe limits, the submarine clawed forward only a few meters at a time, fighting not just the storm, but the Arctic's shifting currents that dragged at the hull like an unseen hand trying to pull the vessel back into the ice fields. And then, as if the sea itself had decided to crush the last of their resolve, a rogue wave, one of those towering, unpredictable giants born from colliding wind patterns, struck the submarine broadside, tilting K371 so violently that several sailors were thrown to the floor, and the sealed fire damage compartment shifted with a sickening metallic groan, prompting the damage control chief to warn that the internal bracing might fail if the submarine rolled again. And if that happened, the warped bulkhead could rupture, instantly flooding the forward section with freezing water and eliminating any chance of saving the trapped survivors. On the bridge, the captain steadied himself and shouted new orders, his voice barely audible over the shrieking wind as he demanded a course correction to bring the submarine parallel to the waves. But the helm controls lagged with an ominous stiffness that suggested the hydraulic system, already stressed from the fire and the temperature drop, was beginning to freeze, and every second of delay threatened to turn the vessel sideways into the waves, a position that would almost certainly capsize even a nuclear submarine. Meanwhile, the reactor officers reported another spike in coolant temperature, warning that the uneven power demands were destabilizing the improvised cooling loop as ice particles formed inside the emergency piping, reducing flow and forcing them to manually vent heat into compartments that were never designed to handle it, which meant the air inside the engineering section was now so hot and humid that frost built on the crew's eyelashes each time they stepped back into the frigid corridor. Still, with desperation driving them, the sailors managed to coax a final burst of thrust from the wounded reactor, and for a moment, a brief, fragile moment, it appeared to work. The submarine pushing through a gap between two massive ice floes just as they collided behind her, with a thunderous crack that reverberated through the hull like a cannon blast, prompting several sailors to cross themselves instinctively because they knew. Had the captain hesitated by even 10 seconds, K-371 would have been crushed between the slabs like an aluminum can in a vise, ending the story right there in the dark heart of the Arctic, with no one left alive to tell it. But survival in the Arctic was never won in a single moment. It had to be earned again and again. And as K-371 pushed free of the crushing ice, the crew realized their situation had somehow managed to grow even worse, because the fire-damaged compartment was now leaking traces of radioactive steam into an adjoining junction where emergency cables had been routed after the initial explosion. And if the insulation continued to melt, the reactor's control relays could short out and trigger either an uncontrolled power surge or a total shutdown, both outcomes equally deadly in sub-zero waters. The captain ordered immediate containment, but the only way to reach the junction was to crawl through a maintenance shaft barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, a shaft that was now heated to nearly 60 degrees by the redirected coolant lines and filled with vapor so hot it scalded exposed skin, prompting the engineers to argue that sending someone in would be suicide. Yet they also understood that not sending someone would doom all 98 souls aboard, and so a volunteer stepped forward, a young technician named Belyakov, who had joined the submarine fleet less than a year earlier and was now tying a soaked cloth over his face as a makeshift filter, knowing full well it would provide almost no protection. He entered the shaft without hesitation, dragging a tool pouch behind him as the metal walls seared through the knees and elbows of his uniform, crawling deeper until the vapor grew so thick that the men monitoring him by radio could hear him coughing violently between breaths, but he pushed onward until he reached the junction, where he discovered that the heat had warped the cable bundle so badly that the insulation had peeled away like melted candle wax, exposing live wiring, crackling with arcs of current that illuminated the smoky air in brief flashes of blue, and with trembling hands he began applying emergency insulation strips, each movement a battle against the burning metal and the rising temperature that made his vision blur. On the bridge, the captain stood motionless, head bowed, listening to the technician's ragged breathing over the headset, knowing that every second Belyakov endured was buying the submarine a few more seconds of life. And then at last, after what felt like an eternity, Belyakov whispered that the cables were secured, though his voice was slurred and drifting as he tried to crawl backwards through the shaft. But halfway out he collapsed, and the rescue team dragged him free with blistered hands, his uniform soaked with sweat and coolant, his face pale from radiation exposure. Yet, even unconscious, he still clutched the insulation tool in his hand, like a soldier refusing to drop his weapon. The captain ordered immediate medical treatment, though everyone knew their supplies were limited and the damage already done. And as the submarine steadied in calmer water, the crew understood what had just happened. Not just a repair, not just a sacrifice, but the moment the men of K-371 quietly accepted that some of them might not make it home, yet they would fight the Arctic, the reactor, the ice, and fate itself to drag the submarine back to Soviet waters, because giving up was simply not an option buried beneath 1,000 meters of black water and crushing ice. But even with the junction stabilized and the reactor no longer seconds from failing, K-371 remained a wounded animal drifting through hostile waters, and as the hours passed, the crew began to feel the deeper consequences of the disaster. The temperature inside the submarine plummeted because the fire had damaged thermal regulators, forcing men to work in near-freezing air, while condensation dripped from every metal surface like a constant reminder of the icy ocean surrounding them. And worse still, the auxiliary batteries began to drain faster than expected due to multiple systems running in emergency mode, meaning that if they failed to restore partial power soon, lighting, navigation, and even air filtration would begin collapsing in sequence. The captain summoned his senior officers and held a whispered strategy meeting in the dim glow of emergency lamps, outlining 3 impossible choices: surface through unstable ice and risk tearing open the hull, descend deeper to find warmer waters and risk reactor instability returning, or attempt a mid-depth drift toward an estimated opening in the ice based solely on outdated charts and instinct rather than instruments. After tense debate, they chose the drift, a decision rooted in desperation, but also in the intuitive skill of Arctic submarine commanders, who for decades had trusted their ability to sense the ocean as if it were a living thing. And so the engines were brought online at the lowest possible setting, each rumble echoing through the hull like a tired heartbeat as the submarine angled toward the unknown, guided only by partial sonar returns, distorted by ice. Faint magnetic readings interfered with by damaged wiring, and the experience of officers who had spent more time underwater than on land. As the hours stretched into the night, the morale of the crew wavered, with some men quietly writing short notes to their families in case the worst happened, stuffing them into coat pockets or tool bags as a final, private act of hope, while others sat silently in the mess hall drinking weak tea that had gone cold before the pot even reached the table. And in the torpedo compartment, sailors gathered around the large metal tubes, not just because they were on duty, but because the machinery radiated a small amount of heat, turning the space into the warmest spot on the submarine. Eventually, after nearly a full day of creeping through the dim Arctic waters, the sonar operator picked up a subtle shift in sound, an echo that didn't match the dense patterns of ice. But he said nothing at first, afraid it was a hallucination brought on by fatigue, until a second echo confirmed it. Open water, ahead. The announcement spread through the submarine like a spark of electricity, lifting spirits that had been numb for hours, and the captain ordered a gradual ascent, his hands shaking as he gripped the periscope column, knowing that if the charts were wrong or the sonar misinterpreted, they would rise directly into a solid wall of ice and split the tower clean off the submarine. Minutes felt like hours as K-371 climbed, creaking under pressure, every man holding his breath as the hull approached the surface, until finally, with a low groan, followed by a rush of cold air, the submarine broke through into a narrow pocket of open water, no wider than a village street, a rare gap carved between drifting ice sheets, and the crew erupted into relieved applause, though the celebration was short-lived, because even with the submarine breathing fresh air for the first time since the fire, they were still far from safety and still carrying nuclear weapons in a vessel held together by scorched cables, failing circuits, and the stubborn determination of a crew refusing to die quietly beneath the Arctic ice. But surfacing into that narrow pocket of open water did not mean salvation. If anything, It exposed just how vulnerable K-371 truly was, because the moment they broke through the surface, the bitter Arctic wind knifed into the damaged ventilation system and sent a shockwave of cold through the already weakened electrical circuits, causing several emergency panels to flicker, reset, and spit out warning lights that the engineers had never seen all at once. And as the officers scrambled to interpret the blinking chaos, the captain confronted a new nightmare. Without stable long-range communication, they still couldn't contact Moscow, and every minute spent on the surface risked detection by NATO patrol aircraft that regularly scanned the Norwegian and Barents Seas for exactly this kind of crippled Soviet asset. So he ordered the launch of a short-range signal buoy, a risky move because the buoy's antenna could be intercepted. But it was the only way to get a message out before the storm clouds forming on the horizon swallowed their temporary refuge. The launch tube hissed as the buoy shot upward, breaking into the open air before unfurling its antenna, and the radio men immediately attempted to send a burst-encoded emergency transmission. But even as they did, ice sheets began drifting toward the submarine like closing jaws, threatening to trap them again, forcing the captain to weigh the risk of staying long enough to complete the transmission against the danger of being crushed on the surface. After 30 agonizing seconds that felt like 30 hours, the radioman shouted that the signal had been sent, though whether anyone received it was still unknown. And the captain ordered an emergency dive just as a massive slab of ice rolled toward them, missing the sail structure by less than a meter and slamming into the water with a thunderous crack that sent waves cascading over the deck as K-371 slipped beneath the freezing surface once more. Below, the crew watched droplets of seawater fall from their jackets as they returned to the dim, metallic silence of the submerged world. And though morale briefly wavered, the sense of purpose hardened. If their message had reached Soviet command, help might already be on the way, but if it hadn't, they would need to navigate back alone with a failing reactor, unreliable navigation, and only partial propulsion, essentially a blind nuclear-armed submarine drifting through one of the most heavily monitored and geopolitically sensitive regions of the Cold War. Yet despite the odds, the mood on board shifted from desperation to determination because surviving the fire, the reactor scare, the suffocating crawlspace repair, and the ascent through the ice had forged the crew into something unbreakable. And as they listened to the hum of the damaged engines push them forward, every man understood the same truth. They had already lived through what should have killed them, and now they would fight for every last kilometer until they reached friendly waters or died trying beneath the endless, crushing darkness of the Arctic Sea. But the Arctic had one final trial waiting for them, because as K-371 crept southward at minimal speed, trying to conserve what remained of the battered electrical grid, the sonar operator detected something that turned the entire control room silent. A distant mechanical hum, rhythmic and unmistakable, the sound of a NATO anti-submarine aircraft deploying sonobuoys into the water, each buoy a floating ear that listened for the faintest tremor of a submarine's presence. And before anyone could react, the hydrophones caught the ping, sharp, metallic, and far too close, broadcasting through the hull like a hammer strike, meaning the NATO patrol had detected something unusual and was now sweeping the area, hunting for a submarine that Moscow insisted was on routine patrol, and that NATO intelligence had quietly suspected was missing. The captain froze, knowing full well that with their reactor damaged, propulsion limited, and electrical noise spiking intermittently from half-repaired circuits, they could not perform evasive maneuvers or outrun detection. And the only remaining option was also the most dangerous: drifting silently with all non-essential systems shut down, essentially turning the submarine into a 100-meter-long metal coffin suspended in the water, relying on darkness and luck to hide them from the world's most sophisticated anti-submarine warfare platforms. One by one, lights went out, systems powered down, and men held their breath as the submarine became eerily silent, the only sound the faint groaning of the hull as cold water pressed against it from all sides. Above them, the aircraft continued its search pattern, dropping more sonobuoys whose pings grew louder and closer until at one point the crew could feel the vibrations in the soles of their boots, as if the ocean itself were warning them that discovery would not merely mean embarrassment, it could trigger a Cold War confrontation. Because NATO forces finding a disabled Soviet nuclear submarine carrying live ballistic warheads would escalate into a political crisis neither superpower could control. The captain gripped the periscope column, resisting the urge to surface and surrender, because doing so could trigger misinterpretation, interception, or even hostile action, and instead he watched the sonar operator sweat silently, counting the intervals between pings, praying they would lengthen, not shorten, until finally, after nearly 40 minutes of suffocating stillness, the pings began to fade, then disappear entirely as the aircraft veered off to pursue a phantom contact elsewhere. The crew collectively exhaled in the darkness, their breath visible in the freezing air. But even as relief washed over them, they understood how close they had come to catastrophe, how one faulty circuit spike or accidental noise could have exposed them, and that the ocean, the ice, and geopolitics were all conspiring against them, while they, alone and wounded, fought, inch by inch, just to stay alive inside a steel shell drifting through enemy waters. But survival was never guaranteed, even after escaping detection, because as K-371 continued its slow, wounded journey back towards Soviet waters, the crew began facing a new silent enemy: time. Since the emergency batteries were nearly depleted, carbon dioxide levels were climbing from the prolonged shutdown of filtration systems, and several sailors were showing early symptoms of radiation sickness, including the young technician Belyakov, who drifted in and out of consciousness in the infirmary, mumbling fragments of drill commands and reactor procedures as if his mind were trying to keep him tethered to duty, even as his body failed. The captain checked on him only once, placing a gloved hand on his shoulder. Not as a commander, but as a man acknowledging a sacrifice that had saved nearly 100 others, before returning to the bridge, where the navigation team was piecing together their position using celestial estimates through a cracked periscope lens and the faint, unreliable magnetic readings that flickered like a dying heartbeat. Finally, after nearly 2 days of drifting through the Arctic in this half-alive state, the sonar operator detected something that made him straighten in his chair: the deep, steady hum of a Soviet rescue vessel closing in from the east, its signature unmistakable, and moments later, the radio men confirmed that their signal buoy message had been received after all, triggering a massive search operation that had been combing the Barents Sea for hours. The crew erupted into exhausted smiles, some laughing, others simply slumping against bulkheads as the tension of the last 48 hours drained from their bodies. And when the rescue vessel finally made visual contact, floodlights cutting through the Arctic mist, K-371 surfaced one last time, this time not into a pocket of fragile water, but into the certainty of salvation, as Soviet sailors rushed to secure tow lines and medical teams boarded to treat the injured, including Belyakov, who was carried out on a stretcher while the crew stood silently, giving him the closest thing the submarine fleet allowed to a hero's send-off. As the crippled submarine was towed home, the captain filed his initial report, knowing that the Communist Party would bury the incident deep within classified archives, that NATO would never learn how close they had come to encountering a drifting, reactor-damaged Soviet submarine beneath the ice, and that history would never record the names of the 98 men who fought the Arctic, fire, radiation, failing machinery, international tension, and overwhelming odds to bring their vessel back from the dead. And so K-371 vanished into secrecy, a Cold War ghost, but the crew carried the memory for the rest of their lives. The fire, the ice, the crushing silence, the near detection, the sacrifice. And though the world above never knew the disaster that almost reshaped global politics, the men who lived through it understood something deeper. That sometimes the greatest battles of the Cold War were not fought with missiles or armies, but in the dark, freezing corridors of a failing submarine, where courage, instinct, and desperation became the only weapons keeping global catastrophe at bay.